After 20 plus years in the game, it's fair to say that the Alchemist is a master of beat making. It's what's helped him work with artists like Kendrick Lamar, Drake, Nas, and the entire Griselda crew. And for us, mere beat making mortals, his library of beats is an absolute goldmine to learn from. And so that's exactly what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna break down key beat making techniques the Alchemist uses in his production, how he does them, and also how you can use them in your production as well. Now, even though it's hard to define exactly what an Alchemist type beat even is, I find it's far more helpful to analyze and understand key techniques and ideas of his. And one of my favorites is an idea that I like to call the orbit. Now, what does this even mean? Well, let's take a listen to a couple of beats that the Alchemist produced and see if you can spot the similarities here. The first beat is Broken Bottles by Benny the Butcher.
I got a large bag of clips, hard hats and sticks.
The next is There He Is by Bobby Creekwater.
An executive mind frame for fuck trying to rap.
And the final beat is one that I made, and I'm going to show you how I did so in this video that uses this orbit idea. So let me explain how this beat was made so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And by the way, if you want to download this beat along with all the individual stems and layers so you can analyze and dive deeper yourself, I have dropped a free link to download this in the description box below. Now to start this beat, we have our blank project file here. I'm going to go ahead and set the BPM down to 80. And the first thing that I'm going to do is find a sound or an idea to orbit around. This is a good time to explain what this technique even is. What you may have noticed in these Alchemist beats that I played is that there's one sound in each of these beats that is consistently playing the same note over and over again. In Broken Bottles, it's this sound here. And in There He Is, it's this sound here. And you can almost think of this like it's the sun. It's just sitting there, not going anywhere. But as you know, if you graduated the second grade, the sun has planets orbiting around it that are constantly moving. So we're gonna build our beat the exact same way, by having one sound be consistent and have everything else move around that one sound. And just as a quick side note, I recently saw this random video that explained how this isn't actually an accurate depiction of our solar system. In fact, in reality, it's actually more like this, and the Earth is almost like a child following their parent around the Walmart, hoping it doesn't get lost. I became deeply terrified after seeing this, so I turned it off. Anyways, back to this beat. The first step is to build that consistent layer. But to do this, there are a few things that you need to do correctly. For one, I don't want to use a boring texture like this. Since this sound is going to be consistently playing throughout the entire beat, it's going to be a better idea to pick something that's a little bit more unique. So this is the sound that I will settle on. And here is the repetitive, constant pattern that I will try using with this sound. Now, before I play this for you, one thing that you'll notice is that these notes here have some slight variation to the volumes. This way, we reduce the risk that this pattern sounds overly repetitive and eventually annoying. Small details like this will help. Another helpful tactic if you want to use this technique in your beats is to change the shape of your sound. This is going to be highly important depending on the texture that you use for this technique. For example, if I used a sample that had a shape like this, where the sample is consistently at the same volume, think about what will happen when we build our pattern. It's going to leave a lot less space for us to eventually fit in all those orbiting sounds later on, since this layer would be playing at a consistently high level throughout the entire beat. But by changing the shape of this sound, we can introduce more openness into the beat. And how we can do this is by reshaping this sound so it starts off loud and then tapers off. This tapering will result in quieter pockets being introduced into the beat, which will hopefully provide us with more room for those additional sounds later on. By the way, check out how good of a drawer I am. That's right, I drew this. Pretty impressive, eh? Anyways, I'm gonna replicate this shape using my envelope on my sound. So let's hear how this idea sounds. Alright, great start to this beat already. Now there are a few more things that I need to create before we move on to those orbiting ideas that I plan on including later. So for now, I'm just going to continue creating my loop. Next, let's think about filling the low end. Here, I'm going to do something that's a little bit more unique. Again, instead of just grabbing a simple bass note like this, I'm gonna see if I can come up with something that's a bit different. Now, one of my favorite things to do in this kind of situation is to grab a sound or a sample that isn't traditionally meant to be used to fill up the low end or as a bass for your beat, and I'll just play that at a much lower octave to just see how it sounds. So here, I'm gonna grab this string sample of mine, and I'll play this guy down a few octaves. An interesting idea. I'm gonna see how this sounds if I use a low-end producing plugin like Decapitator, which is often my go-to if I wanna bulk up my drums or my bass. And next, I'm gonna get a little bit naughty here, a little bit freaky. I'm gonna add reverb onto this sound. I know people often say don't add reverb to your bass, but as long as I control which frequencies this reverb is applied to, I should be fine. To me, this just fills up the space in the low end in a really interesting way. Now, as you know, with boom bap beats, drums are a vital component, so before we start adding too much into this beat, I think it would be wise to focus on our drums next. Let's start with a kick. I'm gonna go with something like this that has a bit of color, but not too much. Now, the reason why I don't want to use an over-the-top kick like this one here, for example, is because, again, I need to leave enough space for those orbiting sounds later on. So my drums and how I build my patterns are going to be a little bit more conservative. Same thing with my snare. I'm not going to use an over-the-top boom bap snare like this. I know for many producers, we often feel like these big over-the-top snares are just fun to use. That's definitely how I felt when I first started making beats because I just wanted to sound like Jay Dilla, but sometimes the beat just doesn't call for it. And in my opinion, this is one of those cases since I plan on adding more into this beat later. So therefore, I will go for something that's a bit less colorful and a bit more transient. Next up, we have the hi-hats. Personally, I'm often guilty of going into autopilot mode with my hi-hats and just doing something like this. But let's be deliberate. I want to break my bad habits here. Let's test out how this beat sounds with a far more minimal pattern. And again, this is to leave more space for those orbiting ideas later on. I think this might work, but I feel like I need to do a bit more. Right now, the high end of the beat just doesn't feel as full as I need it to be. And as you know, usually the hi-hats would help with this problem, but since my plan here is to be a bit more minimal, I'm gonna have to fill up this space in a different way. So I'm gonna start by using this static noise here. As well, I'm going to use this random weird hissing sound that I found. I'll use it a bit more creatively and almost introduce it as if it's a percussive layer and build a pattern with it. This loop is coming together nicely. Having said that, I do feel as though adding a more full bass would help this beat. It just feels a bit too thin in the low end, just for my own personal taste. So let's try layering something underneath this bass that I'm already using here. I'm gonna try using this 808. Now, even though 808s aren't something that you automatically think of when it comes to making boom bap beats like this, these undistorted subby 808s were actually commonly used in a lot of old boom bap all the time, like in many old Wu-Tang beats. So let's hear how this would sound in our loop. Now, while I do like this, I don't like the idea of this 808 hitting this frequently. Again, so far what I've built here is a 1-bar loop. So having this hit over and over again this often, it might wear down the listener. So maybe I'll use this 808 a bit more sporadically throughout my entire beat as I arrange. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and move on to arranging this thing. Here, I'm gonna go ahead and use the technique of subtractive arrangement. Now, you might be wondering what this is. For many producers, as soon as they finish their basic loop, they immediately go to arrange. And what they might find is as soon as they need to introduce something new or build a new section, they get stuck. So if this is something that you struggle with, subtractive arrangement is an approach that you can think of using, where instead of arranging as soon as you finish your core loop, you just continue to build more and more and more ideas. That way, when you do move on to arranging, it becomes a game of figuring out which pieces you want to subtract rather than trying to add more pieces as you go. Basically, this can help you because it segments beat making into 2 distinct processes: creation and then arranging, rather than having to go back and forth throughout your entire beat. So to do this, let's continue to create more inside of our loop before we move on to fully arranging this thing. First thing I'm going to do is turn this into a 4-bar loop to give myself more space to play with and reduce how often that 808 hits like I mentioned. Now let's start creating all of our orbiting ideas within this beat, just like the Alchemist does. Let's start with these one-shot samples here. For the next bar in this loop, I'll use this sound here. And I'll create yet another pattern for my loop, but just in a different part of my loop. And I'll just continue to do this more and build more ideas until this loop almost becomes too busy and has too much going on. So now that I have all my pieces, I will turn this into a full beat. But it will become a game of removing different patterns and ideas to see what sounds good and when. And so this overly busy core loop will become much more balanced as I do this. Now, if you want to hear this full beat, and again, download all the stems yourself so you can go deeper and break down this beat, the link is available to download in the description box below. And hopefully you have enjoyed this over-explained video. If you did, leave a comment, like, subscribe. Let me know what you'd like to see next time. But other than that, yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.